The instant I heard about Blue Lagoon, I knew it was a game that I had to get hold of. However, when I finally did pick it up and play it, it turned out to be a case where my admittedly high expectations were not met. To understand where my expectations for Blue Lagoon came from, I have to take you back through a bit of board game history. It was back in '98, see, and his hot new game was sweeping the town, ya dig? 1998. I've gone a little too far back. So '98 was a full 5 years before I would ultimately rediscover the hobby of modern board gaming. And in that year, a fellow named Dr. Reiner Knizia designed a game. Now, Knizia is probably the most prolific game designer to come along since Sid Saxon. And in '98, in Germany, he designed a game called Durch die Wüste, or however the Germans say it. And this game, a full 5 years later, when I got into the hobby, had apparently made a bit of a splash in North America, probably thanks in large part to websites like Board Game Geek popularizing these exotic European games. So I somehow managed to get hold of a German copy of Durch die Wüste, and I printed out some English rules, and I had that game for years, and we had a lot of fun with it. This game that Knizia designed was apparently inspired by a much more ancient game called Go. In it, players are essentially starting with a few camel riders and extending these caravans of camels through the desert. The gameplay is very simple. Players simply take two camels and add them to the board and extend their caravans in that manner. And the game ending is controlled by the players because basically once one color of camels runs out of the supply, then the game comes to an end. So players can potentially rush the end of the game if they think they're winning by placing all of that one camel color on the board, or they can potentially stave off the ending a bit by avoiding camels whose supplies are getting lower. And ultimately though, players' caravans will score them points by reaching water holes of different values, by reaching oases. Players can have points for the largest number of caravans in a single color on the board, or by surrounding and enclosing parts of the board. So there's a number of ways that when the end game score is tallied up, players can acquire points. In the year 2000, the publisher of Durch die Wüste, Cosmos, released an English version of the game called Through the Desert. And then in 2005, Fantasy Flight Games got hold of this title and they printed a much smaller box version of the game, which was great because they took the entire game and condensed it into a much smaller package. Ultimately, though, after years of owning the game and playing it and enjoying it, I sold it in one of my game collection calls, which were required to raise money and create shelf space to purchase newer games. And interestingly, in all the dozens and dozens of games that I've sold off over the years in order to rotate my collection regularly, it's one title that I keep thinking about and wondering if only I'd gotten hold of a Fantasy Flight small box edition, because it was a really simple game, but it presented the players with some really agonizing decisions on every single turn. But anyhow, I'm going to come back to Through the Desert a bit later when I talk about Blue Lagoon. In the meantime, we'll jump forward to 2005 with the release of another game called Hey, That's My Fish, which was designed by Gunther Cornett and Alvydas Yakuliunas and published by Mayfair Games. It takes about 1 minute to learn the rules and maybe 5 or 10 minutes to play through a game, but it's another one that presents a lot of tense and interesting decisions. Players are basically controlling 2 to 4 penguins, depending on the number of players in the game, and they're moving them around the map, collecting the tiles that the penguins just left, and at the end of the game they're tallying up the number of fish that they've collected throughout the game. I was instantly smitten by Hey, That's My Fish. So in 2008, when Mayfair released a deluxe version of the game that replaced the original wooden penguins with really cute plastic penguins, I decided to sell my original copy. I decided to sell my original copy and pick up the deluxe version. And then one Christmas, my wife surprised me by making me a bunch of really cute Fimo penguins for the game too, which just added to my enjoyment, of course. So we're going to leave that game for a minute too and jump from cute penguins to zombies with a title called Zombiegeddon that Reiner Knizia designed and was released in 2009 by Twilight Creations. Now this game was kind of weird because the very next year in 2010 the publisher Amigo released a game called Jäger und Sammler that was almost an identical game to Zombiegeddon. The main difference obviously is with the theme of the games, the zombies versus the Stone Age hunters and gatherers. Now Zombiegeddon was a terrifically ugly, horribly visually designed game. Whoever did the art and graphic design for the game just created a big muddy mess that must have made the game visually extremely difficult to play. Rules-wise, they were almost identical, which is weird that within a year of each other, Reiner Knizia managed to sell, I guess, the same game to two different publishers with, in terms of rules, only a couple of very small tweaks. So anyways, when Jäger und Sammler was released, I managed to get hold of this one. I don't think it was ever released in an English edition. This is another one that I had to get through a German supplier. For the sake of translation, Jäger und Sammler means hunters and gatherers, and it is visually, at least, a much nicer game than Zombiegeddon was. Anyways, with these two games, Jäger und Sammler and Zombiegeddon, I imagine that Reiner Knizia looked at Hey, That's My Fish and said, that's a really cool game. I think I could add to that and really create some really interesting elements and make it just a slightly bigger and more interesting game. Because from a gameplay perspective, there are some obvious similarities. Players are moving their Stone Age people around this map, collecting the items that they pick up as they go. You can see that just like with Hey, That's My Fish, the board shrinks as the game progresses, and players are acquiring points for the tiles that they pick up as they move. One thing that really sets it apart though is that as players' characters reach the winter camps, they will place their tents there, and then when the summer phase is finished, all the summer tiles that can be picked up have been picked up. Any remaining green tiles are removed, leaving just these stone pathways and the caves. And a whole set of winter tiles are placed on the board, and the game is played a whole second time again. Now the summer camps, if they are reached, the camps can be placed in the summer camps there, and points will be awarded for those tents. The only major rule difference between this game and Zombiegeddon is that these pathways in Zombiegeddon are impassable, whereas in Jäger und Sammler these places can be passed through. However, I enjoy Zombiegeddon's rule better, so when I play this game, I say that these rocks are impassable because it makes for a tighter and more interesting gameplay experience. I better mention that these particular Stone Age people and these fires are extra components that I've acquired that do not come with the game. Just as an aside, it's kind of funny to note that despite being almost identical gameplay-wise, Zombiegeddon on Board Game Geek has an average rating of 5.7 out of 10, whereas Jäger und Sammler has an average rating of 6.7 out of 10, which must be entirely due to the visuals of the games. But anyhow, to complete my history here, in 2011, Fantasy Flight Games apparently thought that, Hey, That's My Fish was a little too aggressive, and decided to release a version with one fewer exclamation mark, replacing it with a comma. Hey, that's my fish! Anyways, I ended up purchasing that one too because it came in this tiny little portable box that I thought was fantastic. So obviously, again, I still have my female penguins that my wife made, but now I have a nice portable box to go with it, as well as a homemade board for the game. And I will also note that Through the Desert is getting a reprint, or it has gotten a reprint, I should say, through Z-Man Games. And it's out there if you're interested in getting hold of it. But after all that, we're finally up to 2018 when Blue Lagoon hit the market. I'm going to give you a quick and incomplete overview of the gameplay just so you can see why I spent the time talking about these 3 or 4, I guess, other games. We have a map here with 8 islands, and on these islands are 4 resource types. We have bamboo, water, coconuts, and precious stones. In addition to the 4 resource types, we also have these statuettes. Players are essentially going to take turns placing one of their explorers, either boat side up if they're placing in water, or I guess regular explorer side up if they're placing on land. And as they place on top of spaces with resources or statuettes, they're going to take those into their possession, and they're going to keep playing in that manner until either the last resource, not statuette, has been collected, or all players have played all of their explorers. Just as with Zombiegeddon and Jäger Ensemble, there's going to be a whole second half of the game. But I will mention that during the first half of the game, players can place a person on a boat in any water space. But if they place on land, they have to connect to one of their pieces that's already on the board. In addition to that, if they're connecting onto land, they can place one of their villages. And just as with Jäger Ensemble, these villages represent the starting points where explorers can be placed in the second half of the game. Because after the first half is completed, you're basically going to tally up all the players' scores. Then they're going to clear off any remaining pieces on the game board, then distributing them randomly again so that all the resources and statuettes are back on the board, with only those and the players' villages remaining, and then the second half of the game will begin. The only real difference with the second half of the game is that pieces can only be placed next to where players already have pieces. So instead of being able to place anywhere in the water, now a player would have to start next to one of their villages that they placed in the first half of the game, and from there they could spread out using their existing lines of explorers or their other villages, as long as they are touching a piece that's already in play. The game end is reached in the same manner by clearing out all the resources or playing all the explorers, and then an identical scoring is going to happen in the second half of the game, and then the scores for both halves will be tallied together for the players' final scores. For the actual scoring, there's a whole bunch of different ways that players can acquire points. They can get points for having explorers on a whole lot of different islands. They can have points for having the most explorers on individual islands, or for reaching a number of different islands with a single chain of explorers, or for having the majority of each of the 4 resource types, or just for collecting statuettes. They're worth points for each individual statuette collected. In this manner, Blue Lagoon is a cross between Through the Desert, with the connections of caravans versus connections of explorers, and in the multiple ways that scoring can occur, with a game like Jäger Ensemble, with the 2 distinct halves of the gameplay, with the first half dictating where you can start your placements for the second half of the game. It's because of this obvious connection and the fact that I don't have Through the Desert anymore that I was so excited to get hold of Blue Lagoon. But let me tell you a little bit about why there's some issues that I have with the game. But don't let my misgivings dissuade you from trying the game, because based on other comments and reviewers that I've seen, this game has been almost universally very well received. So let me dive into some details here. First off, I got to mention the component quality. If you see blue-orange on the box, you know you're going to get stellar components. They always knock it out of the park with the production quality of their games. Every piece here just looks fantastic. The artwork, the design, everything looks great. Now, as for the actual gameplay, my main issue is the fact that it just lacks the real tension of decision making that I felt in every single one of the previous games that I highlighted. This is due to a couple of factors. First of all, in the first half of the game, it's super easy to go anywhere on the map you like because you can place in any water hex. And then when it comes to actually placing your little village hut tokens here, it's very easy to get all of them out on the board, so that in the second half of the game you have a lot of options for spreading out your explorers. So unlike with Hunters and Gatherers, where it's actually pretty difficult to get to all 4 of those winter camps so that you have 4 workers to use in the second half of the game, it's really quite easy to get your villages in play and then use them to do what you need to do in that second half of the game. So from my perspective, really the whole first half of the game felt fairly pointless. The other issue I had was with how the scoring works out in comparison to the player count. Now, I'll say that I've played this game with 2 players and 3 players, but I have not tried it with 4. However, with 2 players, it was just really wide open, and you'd reach a point eventually in the game where one half of the board was cut off for the other player, so you had your own halves of the board to work in, which didn't create for a great deal of tension towards the end of that portion of the game. But let me talk about the scoring for a bit, and I will say that I'm not going to complain about stuff without offering solutions. So as I go over the details of the scoring issues I had, I will present the variants that I've come up with and played with a fair deal of success. Now, what I'm not trying to say is that I'm a better game designer than Reiner Knizia. That'd be ludicrous, of course. It's just that they're trying to create a game that will be approachable to as wide a number of people as possible. Whereas I've been tweaking the game a little bit to make it more towards the gameplay experience that I personally am looking for, which is not going to be necessarily the same play experience that everyone's looking for. The first thing I did with my own variant is that I just eliminated the first half of the game, and I replaced it instead with a really brief setup period where, depending on the number of players, each player would start with a certain number of villages. So in a 2-player game, players will have 5 villages each, in a 3-player game 4 villages, and in a 4-player game 3 villages each. And players will take turns in reverse player order, placing one of their villages in any land space on the map that is not either a statuette or a resource space, basically a empty land space. After that, play will continue almost identically to the second half of the game in the original rules, where when a settler is placed, it must be placed either next to what player's existing settler or to one of their villages. The only difference I made for the placement rules is that players can't have more than one of their own boat pieces next to each other. So in other words, a player's boat pieces have to have at least one space in between them. This makes the water slightly more difficult to traverse, and it really tightens up what used to be just a wide open board to make blocking more viable and to make the tension a little bit higher. Also, I didn't really like how the end game was triggered, because what would typically happen for us was that as the game played out and players sectioned off their own portions of the board, there would always be that one last resource token on the board and one player who had access to it, so they could essentially decide if they wanted to continue the game by not getting that resource right away, or if they thought they were doing really well to just grab the resource and end the game, which basically left that decision in the hands of a single player, as opposed to with Through the Desert, that decision is kind of in the hands of all players, because all players have access to all the camel colors at all times. So with my variant, I play until all explorers are placed on the map. Even if everything has been picked up from the board, there's still opportunities to score based on majorities and reaching different islands. So let's have a look at the scoring now. As I talk about the scoring here, I will just also simultaneously talk about my own variant scoring. Now, the original scoring system is not balanced based on the number of players, and it totally makes sense why it wouldn't be, because they would have to create a different score sheet for each of the player counts, and it's already a fairly convoluted and involved scoring process here, so it totally makes sense why they wouldn't want to publish a different scoring distribution for each player count. So we'll go through these one at a time. First of all, with the original scoring, players would be awarded 10 points if they reached 7 islands with their explorers, or 20 points if they managed to reach all 8 islands. This is obviously much easier to do if you have fewer players in the game, so I've adjusted those points according to the player count. With 2 players, I give 0 points if 6 islands are reached, 10 points for 7 islands, or 20 points for 8 islands. With 3 players, it's 6 points for 6 islands, 12 points for 7, 24 points for 8 islands, and then with 4 players in the game, it's 10 points for reaching 6 islands, 15 for reaching 7, or 30 if somehow in a 4-player game you can reach all 8 islands. Because basically, I imagine you would have to spend your entire game doing that and ignoring all the other scoring options. So next scoring item is the number of islands reached in your longest single connected line of pieces. In the original scoring, it was 5 points per island reached, and just as with the previous category, this is going to be much easier to do with 2 players versus 4 players. So what I've done is with 2 players, you get 5 points per island reached. With 3 players, you get 6 points per island reached, and then with 4 players, it's 7 per island reached. Next up, we have the actual points for having the most on a single island. And in the original game, the points are different based on which island you actually have the majority in. And I haven't touched that all because the point values are actually printed on the map and it shows the points awarded per majority, and there was no real need to adjust that. Next up are the resource tokens, and the original scoring awarded points based on the number of tokens you had in each individual resource type. So you would receive 5 points if you had 2 of a single resource, 10 points for 3, or 20 points if you had 4 or more of the same resource. Now, I thought it would be just more fun to differentiate the resource types a little bit because the original game doesn't differentiate at all between the 4 resource types. So I've awarded different values to different resources. The actual point value doesn't change based on the player count, but basically for all player counts, the coconuts give 3 points for 2 collected, 6 for 3, 12 for 4. For bamboo, it's 4 points, 8 and 16. For water, it's 5, 10, and 20. And then for the precious stones, you get 6 points for collecting 2 of them, 12 for 3, and 24 points for 4 of them. So that creates a really interesting dynamic with making some of the resources more valuable than others. The original game awarded 10 points if a player managed to collect a complete set of at least 1 of each resource type. And what I've done is actually both awarded points per set collected. So the original game basically said if you had 2 complete sets of each resource type, it didn't matter, you just got your 10 points. Whereas I'm saying if you managed to somehow get 2 of every one of the 4 resource types, you should get a full point awarded for that. And again, this is going to vary by player count because it becomes increasingly difficult to get those complete sets with more players in the game. With 2 players, I award 10 points per set of resources collected. In a 3-player game, it's 12 points per complete set, and in a 4-player game, it's 15 points per complete set. And then finally, I haven't changed the point values for the statuettes. In the original game, it was straight up 4 points per statuette collected, and I've kept it the same too with my own variant scoring. I hesitated to make this video because internet people get awfully cranky if you A, talk negatively about a game, or B, dare to suggest variants for a game because the rules as written in the rule book are obviously as God intended the game to be played, and how dare you to suggest anything otherwise. But I wanted to put this out there so that if people did have any of the same issues I had, they'd be presented with another way to enjoy this game even more. Because these variant rules I've found have worked very well for myself, and it certainly made the game snappier because you don't have to pull out all of those resource tokens and repopulate the map again in between game halves and do the exact same scoring twice. You just play your 1 round, you get your score, and you're done in 10 minutes, and you've had a fun and much more tense and interesting experience than I had with the original rules. So again, not trying to knock Blue Orange Games, they did an amazing job with the game. Not trying to knock the good Dr. Knizia. He's obviously a prolific and amazing designer. He's got some great stuff. I've got other of his games on my game shelves. Really, I just wanted to talk about games. I hope you'll let me know in the comments what you think, and maybe even suggest some games for me that I might enjoy based on the ones I've just talked about. And I wish you happy gaming. Hi, it's Josh here, just taking a minute to ask you to push all the buttons. Push the buttons, like, subscribe, do the notification bell, all the stuff, all the buttons. Now, Dr. Knizia is probably the most prolific. It turned out to be a case where my admittedly high expectations were not met. They'll score points by they'll score points by their caravans reaching water holes of various point values, which was designed by Gunter Cornet and Alvidas Yakuliunas, which was designed by Gunter Cornet and Alvidas Yakuliunas. It takes about 1 minute to learn how to play the game, and 5 or 10 minutes to maybe. It takes about 1 minute to learn. It takes about 1 minute to learn how to play the game, and maybe. And my wife surprised me one Christmas by making me a whole bunch of cute little Fimo penguins in different. What do you call it? From a gameplay back just cracked. Oh, I'm recording. Excellent. Dare to talk negatively about it. Shouldn't do that with the mics on the table. They would have. I hope you'll let me know in the comments. I hope you'll let me know in the comments what you think, and that you. I hope you let.